Sometimes the greatest mistake a wealthy man can make is believing that a human heart can be measured by a bank account. The crystal chandeliers of the Sterling Grand Hotel shimmered above a ballroom filled with America's most influential families, where conversations floated through the air as effortlessly as the music played by the string quartet. Every polished marble floor reflected tailored tuxedos, elegant gowns, and generations of inherited privilege. At precisely 8 o'clock, billionaire Richard Sterling stepped onto the stage, his silver hair immaculate, his posture commanding the attention of every guest without the need to raise his voice. He smiled the way successful men often smiled when they believed they controlled every outcome. "Tonight," he announced, lifting a crystal glass, "my daughter will choose the man she wishes to marry." A ripple of excitement swept through the room. Young entrepreneurs straightened their jackets. Ivy League graduates exchanged confident glances. Sons of governors, investors, and Fortune 500 executives quietly rehearsed their smiles. Everyone assumed the evening had been carefully arranged. Everyone believed destiny belonged to the wealthy. Amelia Sterling remained seated near the front, her calm blue eyes revealing none of the pressure quietly resting on her shoulders. She had spent her entire life surrounded by luxury that never quite filled the emptiness left by genuine connection. For years, men had admired her family name before they ever cared to know her heart. She had smiled politely through charity galas, private dinners, and carefully orchestrated introductions, yet none of those conversations had ever felt real. Across the ballroom, standing near the entrance with quiet humility, Ethan Brooks adjusted the sleeve of his simple navy sport coat while balancing his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, on his hip. He had not come looking for attention. He had only accepted a last-minute invitation after spending the afternoon repairing custom woodwork for the hotel's historical library, a project funded by the Sterling Foundation. His paycheck would help cover Lily's asthma medication for another month. That was all he cared about. Lily rested her head against his shoulder, fascinated by the sparkling lights overhead. "Daddy," she whispered softly, "this place looks like a castle." Ethan smiled with the gentle warmth only a devoted father could carry. "Maybe," he answered quietly, "but the best part of any castle is the people who make it feel like home." Amelia heard those words from across the room. She turned before she even realized she had moved. The voice was unmistakable. Months earlier, on a lonely stretch of country highway, the same man had repaired her disabled truck beneath the blazing summer sun, refused every dollar she offered, and driven away before she could even learn his full story. She had never forgotten the quiet dignity in his eyes. Richard raised one hand toward the crowd again. "Amelia," he declared proudly, "the future belongs to those wise enough to choose it. Go ahead. Choose your husband." Hundreds of eyes followed her as she slowly stood. The music faded. Conversations dissolved into silence. She walked past the heirs of empires, past celebrated surgeons, decorated veterans, brilliant attorneys, and celebrated entrepreneurs. Every confident smile gradually disappeared as she continued forward without hesitation. Finally, she stopped in front of Ethan Brooks. Lily looked up with innocent curiosity while Ethan stood completely still, unsure why one of the wealthiest women in America was smiling directly at him. Amelia reached for his hand with complete certainty. Then, in a voice gentle enough to reveal love yet strong enough to silence an entire ballroom, she said, "Dad asked me to choose the man I trust with my future. I choose you." The silence inside the ballroom lingered long after Amelia's words settled into the hearts of everyone listening. Richard Sterling did not respond immediately. Years of discipline kept his expression composed, yet the surprise behind his eyes could not be hidden. Ethan gently lowered Lily to the polished floor, keeping one reassuring hand on her shoulder as though reminding himself that she was still his greatest responsibility. He looked at Amelia with quiet confusion rather than excitement. "Miss Sterling," he said softly, "I think you may have mistaken me for someone else." Amelia smiled with remarkable calm. "No, Ethan. I have never been more certain about anyone." Around them, whispers spread through the crowd like wind moving across an autumn field. Some guests exchanged puzzled looks. Others quietly questioned how an ordinary carpenter had found himself standing in the middle of the most anticipated moment of the evening. Ethan barely noticed any of them. His attention remained on Lily, who squeezed his hand with complete trust. She looked up at him and whispered, "Daddy, is she talking to us?" He knelt beside his daughter, brushing a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face. "Yes, sweetheart, she is." Lily looked toward Amelia and offered the same warm smile she gave everyone she met. There was no fear in her young heart, because children often saw kindness before they noticed status. Richard watched the exchange without speaking. He had spent decades building companies, negotiating billion-dollar agreements, and evaluating character through financial reports and business performance. Yet the simple tenderness between a father and his little girl was something no balance sheet could measure. Ethan finally stood again and took a slow breath. "Miss Sterling," he said respectfully, "I came here because I was invited after finishing work this afternoon. I am not looking for anything beyond giving my daughter a better life. I do not belong in your world." Amelia stepped one pace closer. "Maybe you do not belong to that world," she answered gently. "Maybe that world belongs to people who need to become more like you." Her words left another wave of silence behind them. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered countless mornings beginning before sunrise, driving his aging pickup truck from one construction project to another, measuring every dollar before buying groceries, and reading bedtime stories by the soft glow of an old lamp after Lily had fallen asleep against his shoulder. Life had never been easy after losing his wife, Hannah, to a sudden illness 5 years earlier. Grief had nearly broken him, but becoming both mother and father for Lily had quietly rebuilt him into someone stronger than he had ever imagined. Every Saturday morning they shared pancakes at the same neighborhood diner. Every Sunday afternoon, they visited Hannah's favorite maple tree overlooking the small lake outside town. Lily always left fresh wildflowers beneath its branches while Ethan silently thanked the woman he still loved for teaching him that kindness was never wasted. He had never chased wealth because every spare hour belonged to his daughter. Every decision began with one simple question. Would this help Lily grow into a good person? Looking around the magnificent ballroom, Ethan realized he had nothing that impressed the people surrounding him. No luxury home, no private jet, no famous last name. Only honest work, quiet faith, and a little girl who believed her father could fix almost anything except a broken heart. Without realizing it, those simple treasures had become the very reason Amelia Sterling had never stopped thinking about the man standing before her. Richard Sterling slowly lowered his glass onto the white linen tablecloth without taking his eyes off Amelia. The applause that usually followed every announcement he made never arrived. Instead, the ballroom settled into an uneasy stillness, as though every person present understood they had just witnessed something no amount of money could have predicted. Amelia stood beside Ethan without releasing his hand. There was no rebellion in her expression, only peace. She had spent years learning how to smile from magazine covers, charity photographs, and business interviews, but none of those smiles had ever felt as genuine as the one resting quietly on her face now. Richard finally spoke. "Amelia, may I have a word with you?" His voice remained calm, but every guest recognized the authority behind it. Amelia nodded respectfully before looking at Ethan. "Please do not leave." Ethan answered with quiet honesty. "I have nowhere else I need to be except beside my daughter." Lily reached for Amelia's hand without hesitation. Amelia smiled warmly and accepted it, surprising everyone watching. The little girl studied her for a moment before asking, "Do you like drawing pictures?" Amelia laughed softly. "I used to when I was about your age." Lily's eyes brightened. "Daddy says people should never stop doing what makes their hearts happy." Amelia glanced toward Ethan, who looked slightly embarrassed. "She remembers everything," he admitted. "Children usually do." Those simple words lingered longer than any polished speech delivered that evening. Richard walked with Amelia toward a quiet balcony overlooking the city lights. The summer breeze carried the distant sounds of traffic far below while thousands of windows sparkled across the skyline like scattered stars. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard looked at his daughter with more concern than anger. "I gave you complete freedom because I trusted your judgment," he said quietly. "Help me understand what I cannot see." Amelia folded her hands together. "You taught me that character matters more than appearances when choosing business partners." Richard nodded. "That is true." She continued gently. "Then why should marriage be different?" Richard looked away toward the city. "Because marriage is difficult. It demands stability." Amelia smiled sadly. "Father, I have met men with private islands who could not keep a promise for one afternoon. I have met famous men who treated waiters with less respect than their expensive watches. Wealth can build companies, but it cannot build character. Richard remained silent. Amelia continued, speaking with calm conviction. Months ago, my truck broke down on a rural highway. Ethan stopped to help. He repaired everything in less than 15 minutes. When I offered to pay him, he refused. He smiled, wished me a safe trip, and drove away before I could thank him properly. He had absolutely no idea who I was. That was the first time in years someone looked at me without seeing the sterling name. Richard listened carefully. Since then, Amelia said, I quietly learned about him. Every person in his town described the same man. He repairs broken fences for elderly neighbors without charging them. He builds bookshelves for the local library after work. He coaches youth baseball, even though he barely has time to rest. He has every excuse to become bitter after losing his wife, yet he chooses kindness every single day. Father, I did not choose the poorest man in the room. I chose the richest heart I have ever met. Richard closed his eyes for only a brief moment. Somewhere behind the music, the laughter, and the polished elegance surrounding his family, a question he had never allowed himself to ask quietly settled into his heart. Had he spent a lifetime teaching his daughter how to recognize true value without realizing she had learned the lesson better than he ever had? As Richard and Amelia returned from the balcony, Ethan remained exactly where she had asked him to stay. He was kneeling beside Lily, helping her straighten the ribbon that had slipped from her hair. Around them, conversations had resumed in careful whispers, but he seemed untouched by the opinions surrounding him. Richard studied the quiet father from a distance, searching for signs of ambition or calculation. Instead, he saw only patience. Amelia noticed her father's thoughtful expression and allowed herself to remember the afternoon that had changed everything. It had been early September when she left a charity event outside a small farming community nearly 200 miles from the city. Wanting a few hours away from assistants, security teams, and endless meetings, she had driven alone through rolling hills beneath a brilliant blue sky. Then, without warning, her old pickup truck began sputtering before coming to a complete stop along a quiet two-lane highway. Heat drifted from beneath the hood, while the nearest service station was more than 15 miles away. Amelia sighed, rolled up her sleeves, and opened the hood despite knowing very little about engines. For nearly 20 minutes, passing vehicles continued down the road without slowing. She had almost reached for her phone when an aging blue pickup pulled onto the shoulder behind her. A man stepped out carrying a weathered toolbox. His jeans were stained with sawdust, and his work boots showed years of honest labor. Before saying anything, he glanced toward the engine with calm concentration. Looks like you could use another pair of hands, he said with an easy smile. Amelia returned the smile politely. Only if I am not interrupting your day. He chuckled softly. Helping someone is never an interruption. He introduced himself simply as Ethan. There were no impressive stories about himself, no unnecessary questions, and certainly no curiosity about whether the woman standing beside the truck could afford the repair. He examined the engine carefully, tightened a loose connection, replaced a worn clamp from a small collection of spare parts inside his toolbox, and wiped his hands with an old shop towel. Less than 20 minutes later, he nodded toward the driver's seat. Give it another try. The engine came alive immediately with a smooth, steady rumble. Amelia let out a relieved laugh before reaching into her purse. Please let me pay you. Ethan gently shook his head. Save your money for something that makes you smile. She looked at him with genuine surprise. At least let me thank you properly. He smiled toward a framed photograph resting on his truck dashboard. It showed a little blonde girl missing one front tooth while hugging a large golden retriever. The best thank you I could ask for is getting home in time to eat dinner with my daughter. Amelia followed his gaze to the photograph. She is beautiful. Ethan's eyes softened with quiet pride. She reminds me every day that kindness matters more than success. Amelia offered her business card. Ethan accepted it politely without reading the name printed across the top. Instead, he tucked it into his shirt pocket, wished her a safe drive, climbed back into his pickup, and disappeared down the country road before she could explain who she really was. Standing beside her now inside the ballroom months later, Amelia realized that nothing about that afternoon had faded from her memory. It had not been the repair that stayed with her. It had been meeting the first man in many years who saw a stranded traveler instead of an opportunity. The memory faded as Amelia returned to the present, but its meaning had only grown stronger with time. Richard noticed the quiet certainty in his daughter's eyes, the kind that could not be manufactured by emotion alone. He had spent his life trusting evidence more than instinct, and now he wanted evidence. Amelia had anticipated that long before this evening. She looked toward her father and spoke gently. "I did not decide this tonight. I made this decision one honest moment at a time." Richard remained silent, allowing her to continue. "After we met on that highway, I could not stop wondering whether a man like Ethan was truly as genuine as he seemed. I thought perhaps I had only caught him on one unusually generous afternoon. So I quietly learned more." She explained that she never hired private investigators or used the influence of the Sterling name. Instead, she drove back to Ethan's small town several weekends over the following months without telling anyone where she was going. She dressed simply, parked several blocks away, and spent entire afternoons watching ordinary life unfold. What she discovered never appeared in newspapers or social media, because Ethan never looked for recognition. On her first visit, she saw him repairing the broken porch steps of an elderly widow who insisted she could not afford to pay him. When the work was finished, Ethan simply smiled, accepted a slice of homemade apple pie instead of money, and carried her groceries into the house before leaving. The following Saturday, Amelia watched him coach a youth baseball team at the community park. Several of the children did not even own proper gloves, so Ethan quietly shared old equipment he had restored in his garage. He celebrated every child with the same encouragement whether they hit the ball or missed it completely. "Winning feels good," Amelia heard him tell them, "but becoming the kind of person your family is proud of lasts much longer." Those words remained with her for days. On another afternoon, she visited the local library. The librarian smiled the moment Ethan's name was mentioned. She explained that every winter he repaired shelves, tables, and reading benches after finishing his regular jobs, refusing every payment because, as he often said, every child deserved a place where imagination could grow. Amelia also noticed something even more remarkable. Every evening at exactly 5:30, no matter how busy his day had been, Ethan stopped working. He never accepted jobs that would keep him away from Lily at dinner. They cooked together, completed homework together, and ended each night reading one chapter from a favorite book before bedtime. There were no expensive vacations or luxurious gifts. There was only consistency, patience, laughter, and love. Amelia realized she had spent years attending glamorous charity dinners celebrating generosity, while the kindest man she had ever met quietly practiced generosity when nobody was watching. As she finished speaking, Richard looked across the ballroom once again. Ethan was helping Lily carefully balance a small dessert plate while reminding her to thank the server with a warm smile. The young employee looked genuinely touched by the little girl's polite words. It was such a small moment that most people overlooked it entirely. Richard almost did as well. Yet something inside him shifted as he watched Ethan gently place a folded napkin beneath Lily's plate so she would not spill chocolate on her dress. There was no audience, no cameras, no applause. Only a father teaching his daughter that respect was something to be practiced in the smallest moments, especially when no one believed they were important. The atmosphere inside the ballroom changed so gradually that almost no one noticed it at first. Conversations became quieter. Smiles became more cautious. The certainty that had filled the room only an hour earlier had begun to fade, replaced by curiosity that no amount of wealth could satisfy. Richard Sterling slowly approached Ethan, stopping only a few feet away. Every guest instinctively watched, expecting a confrontation that never came. Richard extended his hand instead. Ethan accepted it respectfully. "Mr. Brooks," Richard said in a measured voice, "would you mind joining me for a conversation?" Ethan glanced toward Lily before answering. "Only if my daughter can stay close." Richard looked down at the little girl. "She is welcome wherever her father is." Lily smiled politely. "Thank you, sir." The simple manners caught Richard slightly off guard. He had attended elite boarding schools, prestigious universities, and international business summits, yet he had rarely heard gratitude expressed with such natural sincerity. They stepped into a private sitting room beside the ballroom, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Soft jazz drifted faintly through the closed doors while the lights of the city stretched toward the horizon. Richard remained standing for a moment before speaking. Mr. Brooks, I have spent decades making difficult decisions. Every important choice requires careful evaluation. I hope you understand why I need to ask a few questions. Ethan nodded calmly. You have every right to protect your daughter. Richard appreciated the answer. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to impress him, only quiet respect. Do you love Amelia? Richard asked directly. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked toward Lily, who had discovered a small bookshelf in the corner and quietly flipped through the pages of a children's picture book. Only then did he return his attention to Richard. I admire her kindness, he replied honestly. I respect her courage. But love is too important a word to use carelessly. I would never claim something that has not had time to grow. Richard studied him carefully. Most men in this room would have answered differently. Ethan smiled gently. That may be true, but promises deserve time, not pressure. Richard slowly folded his hands behind his back. If Amelia married you, your life would change completely. You could have homes around the world, unlimited financial security, and opportunities most people only dream about. Ethan listened without interruption. When Richard finished, he quietly shook his head. Money can make life more comfortable. It cannot replace character. My daughter has already lost her mother. I cannot allow her to lose the simple life that has taught her gratitude, honesty, and compassion. Richard raised an eyebrow. You would refuse everything I have built. Ethan answered with the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. I would refuse anything that asks me to become someone Lily would no longer recognize. Silence settled between them. Richard had negotiated with presidents, investors, and corporate leaders who measured every sentence for advantage. Ethan measured his words for truth instead. Before Richard could ask another question, Lily walked over carrying the picture book. Daddy, she whispered, may I borrow this if they say it is okay? Ethan smiled warmly. First we ask politely. If the answer is no, we smile anyway because the book still belongs to someone else. Richard watched the exchange in thoughtful silence. The lesson lasted only a few seconds, yet it revealed years of careful parenting. For the first time that evening, the billionaire realized he was no longer evaluating a man who happened to be poor. He was quietly comparing that man to every wealthy person he had ever trusted, and the comparison was becoming more difficult than he had ever imagined. When they returned to the ballroom together, hundreds of conversations faded into a cautious hush. Word had already spread that Richard Sterling had spoken privately with Ethan Brooks for far longer than anyone expected. The room searched Richard's face for answers, but the billionaire revealed nothing. He simply walked with measured confidence back toward the center of the ballroom, while Ethan remained a respectful distance behind with Lily standing beside him. Amelia watched both men carefully. She recognized something subtle that most people missed. Her father no longer looked at Ethan with disbelief. He looked at him with curiosity. That alone felt like the beginning of a miracle. One of the invited guests, a well-known investment executive named Charles Whitmore, finally stepped forward. He forced a polite smile that barely concealed his frustration. Richard, he said with a light laugh, surely this has all been an unexpected misunderstanding. Amelia is emotional tonight. We all understand that. Several guests nodded quietly. Charles turned toward Ethan. No offense, Mr. Brooks, but surely you realize there are worlds that simply do not belong together. Ethan met his eyes without anger. Perhaps, he answered calmly. But kindness has always crossed boundaries more easily than pride. The room became still once again. Charles gave a dismissive smile. Kindness does not build companies. Ethan nodded. No, but character keeps them standing after difficult days. A few guests lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Richard listened without interrupting. He wanted to see how Ethan handled disrespect when no one came to defend him. Charles folded his arms. Tell me honestly, if Amelia walked away tonight without her family's fortune, would you still stand here? Ethan answered without hesitation. If she walked away from everything except her character, she would still have everything worth protecting. Amelia quietly smiled. Richard noticed it. Charles looked briefly unsettled before forcing another question. And what could you possibly offer someone raised in extraordinary privilege? Ethan looked toward Lily, who was carefully sharing a small cookie with another little girl whose parents had become distracted in conversation. He smiled softly before answering. Peace at the dinner table. Honesty when life becomes difficult. A home where children know they are loved every single day. I cannot promise luxury beyond what honest work provides, but I can promise that no one in my family will ever wonder whether they matter. His words carried through the ballroom with remarkable gentleness. There was no attempt to win an argument, no effort to embarrass anyone, only simple truth spoken with quiet dignity. Richard noticed something even more revealing. Ethan never once tried to convince Amelia to defend him. He never reached for her hand to strengthen his position. He stood on his own character, allowing his actions to speak where pride remained silent. Lily suddenly tugged lightly on Ethan's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered. That little girl dropped her bracelet. Ethan immediately knelt beside her. "Then let us help her find it." Without another word, father and daughter carefully searched beneath nearby chairs until Lily spotted the tiny silver bracelet resting beneath a tablecloth. She picked it up with both hands and returned it with a bright smile. The grateful child hugged her parents before thanking Lily. Ethan simply smiled and quietly stepped back into the crowd as though the moment required no recognition at all. Richard watched every second unfold. No cameras captured it. No applause followed it. Yet somehow that simple act of kindness seemed louder than every impressive speech delivered that evening. In that quiet moment, the billionaire began to understand what his daughter had seen long before anyone else. Some people entered a room hoping to be admired. Others entered hoping to leave the room a little better than they had found it. And Ethan Brooks had quietly been doing exactly that all along. As the evening continued, Richard Sterling quietly asked the orchestra to lower the music until only a gentle piano melody drifted through the ballroom. The room no longer felt like a celebration arranged by wealth. It felt like a place where every person was waiting for a single decision that could change several lives forever. Richard slowly walked toward the stage once more, inviting Amelia and Ethan to join him. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before looking down at Lily. "Would you like to come with me?" She nodded with complete confidence and slipped her small hand into his. Together they crossed the ballroom beneath hundreds of watchful eyes. Richard waited until they stood beside him before speaking. "Tonight was meant to celebrate my daughter's future," he said calmly. "Instead, it has challenged everything I believed I understood about success." The audience listened in complete silence. Richard continued, "Many of you have known me for decades. You know I never make important decisions without careful thought. Therefore, I will not make one tonight." A few relieved smiles appeared among the guests, believing the matter had finally been settled. Richard gently raised one hand. "However, neither will I dismiss a man simply because his life has followed a different path than ours." That sentence erased every smile just as quickly as it had appeared. Amelia looked toward her father with quiet gratitude. Ethan remained still, saying nothing. Richard turned toward him. "Mr. Brooks, I would like to ask one final question this evening." Ethan nodded respectfully. "Of course." Richard's expression softened. "If Amelia asked you to leave everything familiar behind tomorrow and begin a new life with her, what would you do?" The room leaned into the silence. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "I would ask her not to." Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. Richard remained focused. "Why?" Ethan smiled gently. "Because love should never begin with someone giving up who they are. Amelia belongs with the people she loves, just as Lily belongs with me. Families grow stronger when they build bridges, not when they burn them." His words settled over the ballroom with remarkable grace. Amelia felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. This was the same quiet wisdom she had witnessed on that country road months earlier. Richard folded his hands thoughtfully. "And if my family never accepted you?" Ethan answered without bitterness. "Respect cannot be demanded. It can only be earned with time. I would continue living honestly, raising my daughter well, and treating your family with kindness whether they welcomed me or not." Richard slowly nodded. Before he could respond, Lily tugged lightly on Ethan's sleeve again. "Daddy," she whispered, "Grandpa looks tired." Ethan smiled at the innocent choice of words, but Richard heard them clearly. The billionaire looked down at the little girl. "Why did you call me Grandpa?" Lily shrugged with the complete honesty only a child could offer. "Because Miss Amelia smiles when she looks at my daddy the same way my mommy smiled in our family pictures. Daddy says families start when people take care of each other." The ballroom became perfectly still. No one laughed. No one whispered. Richard looked into the little girl's bright blue eyes and saw no calculation, no expectation, only simple trust. In that quiet moment, he realized that the most honest voice in the room had come from the smallest person standing before him. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire found himself questioning not whether Ethan Brooks belonged in his family, but whether his family had been searching for the wrong definition of greatness all along. The evening ended without a final answer, yet no one left, believing the night had been ordinary. As guests slowly departed beneath the glow of the grand entrance, Richard Sterling stood alone near the ballroom windows, watching Ethan help Lily into the old blue pickup that looked almost forgotten among rows of luxury cars. Amelia quietly walked beside her father. Neither of them spoke until the truck disappeared beyond the front gates. Richard finally broke the silence. "Tomorrow morning, I want every fact I can find about Ethan Brooks." Amelia looked at him carefully. "You still do not trust him?" Richard shook his head slowly. "Trust should never fear the truth. If he is the man you believe he is, then the truth will honor him. If he is not, then the truth will protect you." Amelia nodded. She understood her father well enough to know that this was no longer an investigation born from pride. It was a father searching for certainty before placing his daughter's future into another man's hands. Early the next morning, before sunrise painted the skyline with soft shades of gold, Richard arrived at his office overlooking downtown. Instead of beginning with quarterly reports or investment briefings, he instructed his longtime chief of staff, Daniel Harper, to quietly gather information about Ethan's daily life. "No publicity," Richard said firmly. "No interference. I want facts, not rumors." Daniel nodded. "Understood." By noon, the first reports began arriving. Ethan owned no hidden businesses, no investment accounts worth mentioning, and no inherited wealth waiting to be discovered. His modest house carried a small mortgage that he paid every month without missing a single payment. His old pickup truck had more than 200,000 miles on the odometer. His credit history reflected careful responsibility rather than abundance. Richard expected exactly that. What surprised him came next. Daniel entered carrying another folder filled with handwritten notes instead of financial records. "These came from people who insisted on speaking after we asked simple questions," he explained. Richard opened the folder. An elementary school principal described how Ethan had quietly built new bookshelves after a storm damaged the school library. A volunteer firefighter shared that Ethan regularly repaired wheelchairs, walkers, and household ramps without sending invoices. A local grocery manager explained that every Thanksgiving Ethan anonymously paid for several struggling families before leaving the store through the side entrance. None of those acts had ever appeared online because Ethan politely declined photographs every single time. Richard turned another page. The town pastor had written only one sentence. "When someone in our community loses hope, Ethan usually arrives before anyone asks for help." Richard leaned back in his chair, reading that line twice. Late that afternoon, Daniel returned once more. "There is something else," he said quietly. "We interviewed Lily's second-grade teacher." Richard looked up. "What did she say?" Daniel smiled faintly. "She said Lily is one of the kindest children in the entire school. When asked why she shares with everyone, she always gives the same answer. My daddy says love grows when you give it away." Richard slowly closed the folder and rested both hands upon it. Financial statements measured profit. Business reports measured performance. None of those documents had prepared him for a little girl whose greatest inheritance was not money but character. Sitting alone inside the quiet office, surrounded by awards that suddenly seemed much smaller than they had the day before, Richard realized that every answer he had searched for was pointing toward the same remarkable conclusion. Ethan Brooks had never tried to build an impressive reputation. He had simply lived each ordinary day so faithfully that other people had quietly built one for him. 2 days later, Richard Sterling made a decision that surprised even the people closest to him. He did not invite Ethan to another formal dinner, nor did he arrange a meeting inside one of his elegant offices. Instead, he quietly drove to the small town where Ethan and Lily lived. He left his driver behind, wore a simple jacket instead of an expensive tailored suit, and parked several blocks away so that no one would recognize him. For the first time in decades, the billionaire wanted to observe a man without the influence of wealth standing between them. The morning air carried the familiar scent of fresh lumber and autumn leaves as Richard walked toward the community workshop, where Ethan spent most weekdays building custom furniture. Before he reached the entrance, he noticed Ethan loading several handcrafted benches into an old trailer. A church volunteer approached with an apologetic expression. "I am sorry," the woman said. "The youth center cannot pay what we promised. Donations came in lower than expected this month." Ethan smiled as though the news caused him no disappointment at all. "The benches are already finished," he replied. "The children still need somewhere to sit." "That has not changed." The volunteer tried once more. "At least let us pay for the materials." Ethan gently shook his head. "Someone helped me years ago when I needed it most. Maybe this is simply my turn to continue the kindness." Richard remained across the street, listening without revealing himself. Nothing about the conversation sounded rehearsed. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no influential people nearby. It was simply another ordinary morning in Ethan's life. A few minutes later, Lily arrived after school with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She waved excitedly the moment she saw her father. Ethan immediately put down his tools and greeted her with the same warm smile Richard had now witnessed several times. "How was school?" he asked. Lily grinned proudly. "I helped Noah with his math today because he was feeling sad." Ethan knelt beside her. "That was thoughtful. Did he understand the lesson?" She nodded. He smiled afterward. Ethan smiled back. "Then you probably taught him something even more important than math." Richard quietly followed at a distance as father and daughter walked toward a neighborhood grocery store. Inside, Ethan carefully compared prices before placing bread, milk, fresh vegetables, and a small carton of strawberries into the shopping cart. Lily looked longingly at a decorated birthday cake displayed near the bakery. Ethan noticed the glance and walked over. Richard expected disappointment when he saw Ethan quietly checking the price tag. Instead, Ethan smiled and pointed toward the strawberries. "How about we make Grandma Hannah's shortcake recipe together tonight? It always tasted better because we made it ourselves." Lily's face brightened instantly. "Can I stir the batter?" "You always do," Ethan answered with a laugh. Richard watched the little girl happily push the shopping cart away from the expensive display without another word of complaint. On the drive back to the city that afternoon, the billionaire found himself thinking less about Ethan's sacrifices and more about Lily's contentment. She did not measure happiness by what she lacked. She measured it by the love she received every single day. As the skyline appeared once again in the distance, Richard quietly admitted something he had never expected. He had gone searching for flaws that would protect his daughter from making a mistake. Instead, every ordinary hour spent watching Ethan Brooks had become another quiet lesson in the kind of man any father should hope his daughter would one day find. One quiet week later, Richard Sterling invited Amelia to lunch at the small family restaurant where she had eaten as a child long before the Sterling name had become known across the country. There were no reporters waiting outside, no business associates seated at nearby tables, and no carefully planned speeches. Richard wanted a place where success could not hide behind polished boardrooms or expensive celebrations. As they finished their meal, he looked at his daughter with a thoughtful smile. "I spent my entire life believing I could recognize greatness by looking at achievement," he admitted. "Now I am beginning to believe greatness often lives where very few people bother to look." Amelia reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "You always taught me to keep learning, Father." Richard nodded slowly. "Perhaps this is the most important lesson I have ever had to learn." That same afternoon, he called Ethan and asked if they could meet at a quiet park overlooking the lake where families often gathered after school. Ethan agreed without hesitation and arrived with Lily carrying a small picnic basket they had prepared together. Amelia joined them a few minutes later, and for the first time, there were no chandeliers, no formal clothing, and no expectations beyond sharing an ordinary afternoon. Children laughed nearby while ducks drifted peacefully across the water. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine trees through the park. Richard watched Ethan spread a simple blanket across the grass before helping Lily unpack homemade sandwiches and fresh strawberry shortcake. "Did you make this together?" Richard asked. Lily smiled proudly. "Daddy let me stir the batter all by myself." Ethan laughed softly. "She also reminded me not to forget the vanilla." Richard accepted a small slice and tasted it. It was not perfect by the standards of professional chefs. The strawberries were unevenly cut, and the whipped cream leaned slightly to one side. Yet somehow it reminded him of birthdays from decades earlier, before success had filled every moment of his calendar. After a long silence, Richard looked directly at Ethan. "Tell me something honestly," he said. "Have you ever been angry that life has not been fair to you?" Ethan considered the question carefully before answering. "Of course I have experienced disappointment. Losing my wife changed everything. There were nights when I did not know how I would pay the bills. There were mornings when grief felt heavier than the lumber I carried to work. But Lily was watching me every day. If I allowed bitterness to become my teacher, then someday it would become hers as well. I could not let that happen." Richard lowered his eyes. No financial report had ever spoken with such quiet wisdom. Amelia watched both men in silence while Lily wandered toward the lakeshore to collect smooth stones for a small craft project at school. Richard suddenly realized that his daughter had not fallen in love with a man because he promised her a better future. She had chosen him because he had already spent years quietly creating one for someone else. As the afternoon sun reflected across the calm water, Richard understood that the strongest foundation for any family was never built from wealth, influence, or reputation. It was built one ordinary day at a time by a person who continued choosing kindness even when no one was keeping score, and that realization settled over his heart with the quiet certainty of grace. Several days later, Richard Sterling invited Ethan and Lily to the Sterling family estate, not for a formal reception or a business discussion, but for a quiet Sunday afternoon. The sprawling gardens were filled with blooming roses, towering oak trees, and the gentle sound of water flowing through an old stone fountain that had stood there for generations. There were no photographers, no reporters, and no executives waiting to witness the gathering. Richard wanted the day to belong only to the people whose lives had quietly become connected. Ethan arrived wearing the same simple confidence that had impressed Richard from the beginning. Lily stepped out beside him carrying a small flower pot wrapped carefully in brown paper. Amelia welcomed them with a warm smile before kneeling to hug Lily. "Did you bring something?" she asked. Lily nodded proudly. "Daddy and I planted these white daisies together. We thought they might look happy in your garden." Amelia accepted the gift as though it were priceless. Richard watched from the porch without saying a word. He had received paintings worth millions of dollars, rare antiques, and extraordinary works of art throughout his career. Yet no gift had ever been offered with such uncomplicated sincerity. As they walked through the gardens together, Richard found himself noticing details he had overlooked for years. Ethan slowed his pace so Lily could admire butterflies resting on the flowers. Amelia listened patiently as Lily explained every school project she hoped to finish before summer. Nobody hurried the conversation. Nobody checked a phone. Time itself seemed to move differently around people who valued one another more than schedules. They eventually reached an old wooden bench overlooking the lake behind the estate. Richard remained standing while the others sat quietly beneath the shade of a large maple tree. After a long, thoughtful silence, he faced Ethan. "There is something I owe you," he said. Ethan looked surprised. "You do not owe me anything." Richard smiled gently. "I believe I do." He took a slow breath before continuing. "When Amelia first chose you, I measured you by your bank account before I measured your character. That was my mistake, not yours." Ethan answered softly. "Any father would want to protect his daughter." Richard nodded. "Perhaps. But somewhere along the way I forgot that protecting a child also means trusting the values you spend a lifetime teaching them." Amelia quietly wiped away a tear while listening. Richard turned toward her with unmistakable pride. "You saw something I almost missed because you looked with your heart before your eyes." Then he looked back at Ethan. "I have watched how you work. I have listened to people whose lives you quietly changed. I have seen how you raised Lily. You never tried to impress me. You simply continued being yourself." Ethan lowered his eyes with humble gratitude. Richard stepped forward and gently placed one hand on Ethan's shoulder. "If my daughter still wishes to walk beside you, then she does so with my blessing." Amelia covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Lily looked between the adults before whispering, "Does that mean we are family now?" Richard slowly knelt until he was at her eye level. His voice was warm with a tenderness that surprised even himself. "If it is all right with you, I would be honored to earn the chance." Lily smiled brightly and wrapped her small arms around him without hesitation. Richard returned the embrace, realizing that the greatest privilege of his life was not welcoming a humble man into his family, but being welcomed into theirs. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees surrounding the Sterling estate with shades of gold and crimson. On a clear Saturday morning, family and close friends gathered beneath a canopy of white flowers overlooking the same peaceful lake where Richard Sterling had first begun to understand that true wealth could never be counted in dollars alone. There were no extravagant displays meant to impress strangers. The ceremony reflected the people it celebrated, simple, sincere, and filled with gratitude. Ethan stood beside Amelia with the same calm dignity that had defined every step of his journey. Lily wore a small white dress and carefully carried a basket of flower petals, smiling at everyone she passed, as though every guest already belonged to her family. Richard watched them together, his eyes lingering on the little girl who had unknowingly transformed his heart as much as his daughter had. When the officiant invited him to speak, Richard slowly stepped forward. The gentle breeze carried his voice across the quiet gathering. For many years I believed the greatest gift a father could leave his child was security, he began. I worked tirelessly to build companies, create opportunities, and protect the future. I believed success would keep the people I loved safe. But life has a remarkable way of teaching us lessons we never expected to learn. He paused, looking toward Ethan. The day my daughter introduced this good man into my life, I saw someone who possessed very little by the world's standards. I almost allowed that first impression to become my final judgment. Thankfully, my daughter saw more clearly than I did. Amelia smiled through grateful tears, while Ethan quietly lowered his eyes with humility. Richard continued. Over the past weeks I have learned that character cannot be purchased. Integrity cannot be inherited. Kindness cannot be manufactured. They are built quietly through ordinary choices made every single day when nobody is watching. His voice softened as he looked toward Lily. I also discovered that the richest inheritance a parent can leave a child is not money. It is the example of a life lived with honesty, compassion, and unwavering love. A gentle silence settled over the ceremony. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the peaceful stillness that arrives when every heart recognizes the truth. Richard stepped toward Ethan and placed both hands on his shoulders. Take care of my daughter as faithfully as you have cared for yours. Ethan answered with quiet conviction. I will spend the rest of my life earning that trust. Richard nodded before embracing him like a son. There was no applause at first, only stillness. Then Lily slipped her small hand into Richard's and looked up with the same innocent smile that had first called him Grandpa. We should plant more daisies, she whispered. Richard laughed softly through misted eyes. I think that is a wonderful idea. Months later, visitors to the Sterling estate often admired the beautiful row of white daisies blooming beside the lake. Few knew why they had been planted there, but every member of the family remembered. They remembered that one simple act of kindness on a lonely country road had quietly changed 4 lives forever. They remembered that love had entered their family without asking permission from wealth or status. And they remembered that the greatest victories are rarely announced with loud celebrations. Sometimes they arrive in complete silence, leaving behind nothing but grace, redemption, second chances, and the quiet dignity of hearts that finally recognize one another.